Today, Monday, 5th August, even as financial markets around the world crash, we still wait to see what is going to happen with the situation in the Middle East, where with every hour that passes, indications that a major war is now pending grow greater. First thing to say is that there's been reports in the Wall Street Journal that attempts by the United States, European countries, and some Arab states to persuade the Iranians to back off, to, as it's put, mitigate their response to the Israeli assassination in Iran of the Hamas political chief, Ismail Haniyeh, have been rebuffed by the Iranians. Now, we know one specific contact because it's been widely publicized in Iran and in the Middle East, and that is the visit of the foreign minister of Jordan to Iran, to Tehran. Now, this is apparently the first time an Jordanian foreign minister has visited Iran for 20 years. So in itself, it's an important event. It tells us how urgent the situation for Jordan has become. And of course, Jordan is a country caught very much between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, most of the population of Jordan self-identifies as Palestinian. They are strongly affected by the events in Gaza. They're strongly hostile to Israel. They're furious. They were furious with the Jordanian government back in April when it sided with the United States, helped the United States shoot down Iranian missiles which were flying towards Israel over the course of the Iranian missile strike on Israel that was carried out in response to the Israeli attack on the embassy, the Iranian embassy in Damascus. So the Jordanian government understands very well that most people in Jordan, are aligned with Iran over the course of this crisis, are aligned with the Palestinians. Many of them probably by now support Hamas, and that they do not want to see their government, the government of Jordan, in effect protect Israel by assisting the United States to shoot down Iranian missiles. At the same time, Jordan, which is a small country, not fully secure, uncertain perhaps in the long term about its own prospects, is extremely nervous of finding itself caught in the crossfire of an Iranian-Israeli war. Israel is on Jordan's border. They will be extremely nervous about how the Israelis might respond if Iranian missiles start reaching Israel across Jordanian airspace. They will be worried about Israeli aircraft flying into Jordanian airspace, encroaching on Jordanian sovereignty. And of course, they have bitter experiences of wars previously with Israel, of Israeli airstrikes on Jordan. They were very common in the 1960s and in the early 1970s. And they will be very anxious to avoid getting drawn into a war with Israel all over again. So the Jordanians, understandably, want this crisis to end, and this is why the King of Jordan and his ministers have sent their foreign minister, the Jordanian foreign minister, to Tehran to try to get the Iranians to back off in some ways. And I'm sure that Jordan's feelings on this issue are mirrored by those of most of the other Arab countries, or many of the Arab countries. However, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Iranians have proved completely implacable. They made it absolutely clear that, as far as they're concerned, the Israelis have gone altogether too far. I've been reading the Iranian media. They've been saying there that the Israelis have crossed every conceivable red line and did so with the assassination of Haniyeh. And the Iranians have explained to the Jordanians and to the others that they feel that Iran has no choice but to react, and to react forcefully to the events that have taken place in the Middle East, the attack on Haniyeh, and that they will have to act decisively this time against Israel. And apparently they've given warnings. They've made it clear that if the result is an all-out war, well, so be it. They are prepared to risk an all-out war because they feel that they have been left with no choice. So, fairly strong position this time from the Iranians, communicated by the Iranians to the Jordanians and to the other Western countries, to the G7, who sent a letter urging Iran to exercise restraint. And of course, the Iranians are telling the same message, giving the same message to everyone, that they're not prepared to be diverted from their course, that they understand clearly that decisive action, as far as they're concerned, is the only way that they have left, and that decisive action will come. Now, yesterday, according to other reports, Secretary of State Blinken convened a meeting of G7 foreign ministers. Presumably this was a virtual meeting, and apparently he told them over the course of that meeting that he expects the attack by Iran to take place imminently. It could be as early as today. And we've got all of this from Axios, and Axios says that Biden convened the conference call to coordinate with close US allies and tried to generate last-minute diplomatic pressure on Iran and Hezbollah to minimize the retaliation as much as possible. And Blinken stressed that limiting the impact of the strikes is the best chance to prevent all-out war. So the implication here is that the United States understands that an Iranian strike on Israel is now unavoidable, but that what the Americans are trying to do is to get the Iranians to agree to a repeat performance of what happened in April. Iran launches a strike on Israel, communicates the fact to the United States and to the Western countries days in advance, hopes that makes it possible for the Americans to shoot down most of the missiles. A small number of missiles, the more advanced missiles, of course, get through, but they strike basically empty territory. Well, in the case of the April strikes, they actually did strike at some Israeli bases, but the damage that was done was purposefully kept limited, and it was all shown, it all took place somewhat off camera, if I can put it like that. Well, that, according to Axios, is what Blinken is trying to repeat all over again. He's apparently told the G7 that he expects that the attack will take place the Iranian attack will take place could take place as soon as the next 24 to 48 hours, but he has said that he has no actual information about the exact timing of the attack. And we read in Axios that Blinken sounded frustrated, and that the administration had felt that it was close to a breakthrough in terms of the ceasefire in Gaza before the assassination of Haniyeh in Iran. And apparently Blinken said that a deal is now needed more than ever. But at the end of the day, it seems that frustrated and exasperated though Blinken is or appeared to be, the fact is that he outlined no real new plan. And to me, reading this article by Axios, I get the sense that Blinken knows and the United States know that they have basically lost control of this whole situation. Because what they are proposing to the Iranians, that the whole scenario of April be repeated all over again, is one which I think the Iranians will almost certainly reject. Because the Iranians went along with the idea last April of carrying out a large-scale strike. It wasn't a token strike, but nonetheless one which pulled its punches, in the belief, reinforced to them by the Americans, that they were, by acting in that way, restoring deterrence. But we have seen that Israel was not deterred, that they went ahead and assassinated Haniyeh, jeopardizing the progress of the Gaza negotiations. So the Iranians are going to say to themselves, and perhaps to Secretary Blinken, why should we do again that which we did in April, open ourselves up to still more articles in the American media and the Western media, triumphant articles bragging about the supposed ineffectiveness of our missiles, when the deterrence that we thought we had restored in April turned out not to have been restored at all? Why should we repeat that which we did in April and which in fundamental ways has now been shown to have failed? So I'm sure that this is the message that the Iranians are conveying back through the various intermediaries, and perhaps, if there are direct discussions, directly to the Americans, to Tony Blinken himself. And, well, perhaps that explains why Blinken looked and sounded frustrated to the other G7 leaders. And, again, to repeat a point I made at great length in my programme before, these calls for restraint that the West is making are being addressed to the wrong party. It's the Iranians, throughout this crisis, going all the way back to October, who've gone out of their way to exercise restraint. The Israelis have refused to do so. Whenever the Americans have urged them, or have appeared to urge them, to hold back, the Israelis have simply pressed forward. So it's the Israelis who've been escalating in this situation, not the Americans. And one does feel that all this diplomacy that's going on is diplomacy that is being addressed towards the wrong party. Now, as for the Israelis, all the indications are that they are also busy hardening their position, which is exactly what you would expect from the current Israeli government. The Times of Israel is reporting that the Israeli leadership military and political, are prepared to move into a gigantic bunker that has been created in Jerusalem. This bunker complex was apparently created around 20 years ago, but apparently it's now being dusted out and prepared so that the political and military leadership can move there, so that they can be protected from a Iranian attack. And well, that might be a wise thing, because some of the rhetoric that's coming from Iran is pretty fierce. This was from an interview that a Iranian MP, member of the Iranian parliament, gave to IRIB television channel in Iran. The member of the Iranian parliament is Mohammad Qasim Osmani, and he said that I hope that another Operation True Promise, that refers to the Iranian missile attack that took place back in April, will be carried out as an revenge for Ismail Haniyeh. We do not agree to anything less than Netanyahu's death. Now, that might be dramatic, that might be a bit of bombast, but it could be that the Iranians are thinking of retaliating by striking at the Israeli leadership itself, which would explain why Shin Bet and the other Israeli intelligence agencies are now rushing to make sure that the Israeli leadership is protected by being taken into this bunker complex, or having this bunker complex prepared for them. The fact that the Israeli leadership is prepared to move into a bunker and to hunker down there, by the way, suggests that not only is Israel intent on war or preparing for war, but that it is, or that the leadership is, prepared for a long and intense war with Iran. They don't expect that there will be a few missile strikes going backwards and forwards. They are clearly prepared to hunker down and to see this thing out, and that suggests that they are expecting that there will be Iranian missile attacks on Israel over a prolonged period of time, perhaps months, and that the Israeli government is preparing to conduct the war from this headquarters, this underground headquarters in Jerusalem. It all, I'm afraid, has a very disturbing feel about this. As I said, it suggests extreme measures being taken on the Israeli side. And in fact, we've had more actions by Israel over the last few hours. Firstly, the Israelis are reporting that the Hamas minister for economics has been killed in an airstrike in Gaza. The Israeli Air Force, this is the report, has eliminated Abed al-Zarieh, Hamas's economic minister, in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli Army Press Service has said. According to it, Abed al-Zarieh was killed on August 4th as a result of an airstrike carried out on the basis of Israeli intelligence. Israeli military says that al-Zarieh, in addition to his ministerial position, was involved with Hamas's military wing, where he oversaw manufacturing. The manufacturing department operates to increase Hamas's weapons capabilities, including by exchanging information with other terrorist organizations across the Middle East, the Israeli army says. Al-Zarieh had a significant role in directing Hamas's efforts to seize control of humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip and in managing Hamas-controlled markets. Furthermore, he was responsible for the distribution of fuel, gas, and funds for terrorist purposes. Well, that's what the Israelis say. The point is that they've assassinated another top Hamas Hezbollah official. It's the fourth top Hamas, Hezbollah official who's an assassination they have announced over the last couple of days. Again, whatever one may think of al-Zahreh, even if what the Israelis are saying about him is true, it's impossible to see this latest killing at this particular extremely fraught moment as anything else but another major escalatory move. And since we're talking about Hamas, and since there's been more discussions, this brings us back to the fighting in Gaza. It's been a very interesting article about the state of Hamas, the overall situation of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And I'm taking this now from the Daily Telegraph, a newspaper which is a fervid supporter of Israel and which has been consistently supportive of Israeli military operations in the Gaza Strip. Anyway, this is what the Daily Telegraph tells us about the state of Hamas's military military forces in Gaza at the present time. It says that nearly half of Hamas's battalions in northern and central Gaza have rebuilt themselves despite nearly 10 months of Israeli pummeling, according to a new report. Research shows that as of July 1st, only 3 of Hamas's 24 battalions have been destroyed. Among the reasons are the group's ability to replenish their ranks, make effective use of scarce resources, and employ guerrilla tactics. Several units have made a comeback in key areas Israel said it had cleared, according to the analysis by CNN, the Institute for the Study of War and Critical Threats Project. So these are Institute of the Study of War, well known to everybody who follows the fighting in Ukraine. Again, an institution that cannot be faulted for support for Israel. I mean, they are an absolute neocon outlet, and here they're telling us that in fact Hamas has been able to reconstitute its military forces, and that they're back in strength in northern and central Gaza, the very areas that the Israelis had told us were cleared. And we go on to read that the Israelis would say that they cleared a place, but they haven't defeated these fighters at all, said Brian Carter, who led the joint research. Hamas are ready to fight and want to fight. 8 battalions are combat effective, and the remaining 13 have been degraded, with those in central Gaza the least damaged, and the northern battalions rebuilding the fastest. So there we go. 10 months of fighting in the Gaza Strip, and it doesn't seem as if Israel has achieved its objectives there. On the contrary, it looks as if Hamas is continuously able to reconstruct and reconstitute itself. Israel can pick off Hamas leaders in places like Tehran and even in the Gaza Strip itself, but it is not affecting overall Hamas's organization or its cohesion or its ability to continue the struggle. And by the way, it is this failure which lies behind Israel's decision to start escalating the war by going after people like Haniya in Tehran and Shukr in Lebanon and people in other places, these Hamas officials that they've just, this economics minister that they've just killed in an airstrike in Gaza itself. Now, all of this leads me to a few further points which touch on my program yesterday. Yesterday, I discussed at length the fact that Fuad Shukr was not the person who was in fact responsible for the bomb attack on the US Marines in Beirut back in 1983. Now, I said that I'd received it from an authoritative source. That source has now confirmed that I'm able to disclose his identity. It is, of course, Larry Johnson. And as Larry Johnson has pointed out, he was in fact working in the State Department investigating all of these affairs directly. So this is something that he has deep and definitive personal knowledge about. I said yesterday that there had been an enormous amount of misdirection going on about the situation in the Middle East. So it's nice to be able to confirm that it was in fact Larry Johnson who's been able to set the record straight on the assassination of Shukr. And, well, that was just one of the examples of misdirection we've had. Shukr implicated in the events in Beirut in 1983, for which he was not the person who was ultimately responsible. Now, I also made clear yesterday that I'd had deep doubts. I was developing further doubts about the way in which the assassination attempt of Hania in Tehran had been carried out. I said that there was an article in the Financial Times which brought up the possibility that Hania had been killed as a result of a missile strike, contradicting the story that appeared in the New York Times and the Daily Telegraph about the fact that it was alleged to have been a bomb that had been planted in the building. And I said that I'd begun to have serious doubts about the bomb story. I'd never believed that the Daily Telegraph could possibly have been briefed about the details of the bombing in Tehran by members of Iran's own Revolutionary Guard Corps and officials, aides of the president of Iran himself. Well, a few hours later, an article appeared in The Guardian, which, by the way, I can't find anymore. But anyway, it's a very interesting article. It talked about the overall situation in the Middle East, about the fact that the Iranians were not prepared to moderate their position. And, well, the article then veered off into a discussion of the circumstances of Hania's assassination. And it said that there were two completely contradictory stories, the one about the bomb and the one about the missile. It avoided taking sides about the story, which version was correct, but it said that it did seem as if some of these stories were being spread by people who were trying to create trouble between various institutions and factions within Iran. And it rather gently said that some of these stories had also been circulated by certain newspapers that seem to be trying to get ahead over their rivals, which, by the way, I take to be a reference to the Daily Telegraph. That seems to me to be a further sign that someone in the know is trying to make clear that the story of the bomb attack is unreliable and may be untrue, and is briefing sections, at least of the British media, to that effect. On that topic, by the way, there's been a rather interesting comment that I've received, a private email. Again, I can't disclose the person who has sent it, but they've suggested that there might actually be a political reason for the divergence of these two, for the circulation of these two theories or claims about how the assassination was carried out. Supposedly, under international law, if Haniyeh had been killed as a result of a bomb infiltrated inside a building, in other words, as a covert operation, that would not be an act of war. But if it was a missile attack carried out by a hostile force inside Iranian territory that had killed Haniyeh, that would, legally speaking, under international law, be an act of war. And it's because the Israelis do not want to give the impression that they've carried out an act of war against Iran, that they are now apparently supporting the bomb story, the idea that a bomb was planted in the building where Haniyeh was killed. Now, that's an interesting theory. I'm not an expert on this area of international law. I've always understood that carrying out a bomb attack like this could be an act of war. But anyway, whatever. I just put that out because I did think that was an interesting idea, and we will see whether or not, in the end, the Iranians make some play about it, and what the Israelis, if they ever admit to this killing, themselves say. But anyway, the Israelis, as I say, continue to kill people. Economics ministers of Hamas, they continue to conduct bombing in Gaza. They're preparing to hunker down with their ministers in bunkers in Jerusalem. And rather alarmingly, and as a further sign of their willingness to continue to push for further escalation, there's further reports appearing in the Times of Israel, that they're even preparing or prepared to carry out a preemptive strike against Iran. That if they detect that there are Iranian military installations from which military strikes on Israel might come, the Israelis might preempt them and might carry out a strike on those Iranian positions first. Now, of course, that could be in Lebanon, that could be in Iraq or Syria, of course, it could be in Iran itself. Now, as I said, this is an alarming development, and it shows again, to me, that far from Israel lending its support to diplomatic moves at this time, it is signaling again its readiness to continue escalating. So in the light of all of this, I do not understand why anybody seriously expects that the Iranians would be prepared to back off. I can't see what potential benefit there is to Iran from doing so at this time. The Iranians will almost certainly be saying to themselves that if they do back off, they're simply doing the same thing over and over and over again, appeasing, in effect, the Israelis and expecting a different result. And I think that is the clear conclusion that has been reached in Tehran, and I think that the Iranians are going to act on that conclusion so that we will get a strike on Israel from Iran, and it will be a much more powerful one than the one we saw in April. And the Iranians are now making it clear that if it leads to an all-out war, then so be it. A terrible situation that we find ourselves in, and a very, very dangerous one. Now, there is another party that is talking to Iran, and this could be, in fact almost certainly is, extremely consequential, because the website of the Russian Security Council has now confirmed that the secretary of the Russian Security Council and former defense minister of Russia, defense minister until just a few weeks ago, Sergei Shoigu, is now in Iran. And confirmation of this has been provided by the Russian news agency Interfax. Russian Security Council Secretary Sergei Shoigu arrived in Iran for a planned working visit on Monday. While in Iran, Shoigu will hold negotiations with Iranian Supreme National Security Council Secretary Ali Ahmadian. I believe he is a newly appointed official who has been appointed to that post by the new Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian. And Shoigu will also be meeting Chief of the Iranian Armed Forces General Staff, Mohammad Bagheri. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian will receive Shoigu. The negotiations will address a broad range of bilateral cooperation and its enhancement from security to trade and economic projects, as well as various aspects of global and regional security. Now, the way that reads is that this visit was planned weeks ago, that it's not directly connected to the recent developments in the Middle East, to the events, in other words, subsequent to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, and that the Russians and the Iranians agreed that Shoigu would come to Iran soon after the new Iranian president was inaugurated in order to meet with the new Iranian president and with his senior officials, Ali Ahmadian being one, and also to develop cooperation, military cooperation with the Iranian army, with the Iranian military, and specifically through meeting the chief of the general staff of the Iranian armed forces, Mohammad Bagheri. And I'm sure that is correct. I'm sure that this was a meeting that was prepared some weeks ago. But of course, it's now been given a huge additional urgency by the fact that we are now on the brink of a war in the Middle East. I am sure that it is this topic that Shoigu will be principally discussing with Pezeshkian, Ahmadian, and Bagheri. They will be talking about the crisis, the current unfolding crisis in the Middle East. And the Russians, of course, will want to know a number of things. Firstly, they will want to know whether or not the Iranians do intend to respond, and they will want some information about what the nature of that response will be. And secondly, and most importantly, they will want to know how far Iran intends to go and what steps it is preparing to take in order to defend itself against the inevitable Israeli retaliation. And the Russians will also want to know whether or not the Iranians need further assistance from the Russians in parrying that retaliation over and above the assistance that the Russians have already provided by supplying the Murmansk system, electronic warfare system, and any other systems that the Russians have provided that we simply don't know about. And I am going to guess, since we're dealing with the Russians, that they're also going to set their own limits. They will tell the Iranians, look, we're prepared to support you, but we're not giving you a blank check. The Russians are not going to make the same mistake that the Americans did with the Israelis back in October, when the Americans very publicly, over the course of President Biden's visit to Jerusalem, gave the Israelis a blank check. The Russians are not going to do that, nor are they going to conduct themselves in that very public way that President Biden and the Americans did then. And the Russians will try to impress on the Iranians that yes, Russia is prepared to do what it can to help Iran through this crisis, but there is a limit beyond which even Russia cannot go. So ideas, for example, like using weapons of, particular types, mass potentials, attacks maybe on population centers, attacks against oil facilities in the Gulf, ideas about blockading the Straits of Hormuz. Many of these, I suspect, the Russians will tell the Iranians. Russia doesn't want to see them happen. So there will be a dialogue between the Russians and the Iranians about all of this. And I expect that at this time, Iran's priority is to gain as much support as it can. It is, by the way, convening a meeting of the Organization of Islamic States, and it will want as many Islamic states as possible, or the Gulf states, for example, to attend and to express solidarity with Iran in this crisis. And I expect that the Iranians will give the Russians assurances. In the meantime, the Russians, as I said, will almost certainly now press ahead and provide Iran with further assistance to help it deal with the attack, or rather I should say counterstrike from Israel, which is coming. We are on the brink not just of a major war in the Middle East, but of a new proxy war between the superpowers. Just as the war in Ukraine is a proxy war, ultimately, between the United States and Russia, so the Middle East threatens to become a proxy war between Russia and the United States. A more classical proxy war in some respects, more like the ones that were fought during the Cold War. The Russians providing help and assistance to one side, the Americans providing help and assistance to the other, fighting happening outside the territories of each side gaining leverage over their respective allies through the assistance that they're providing, and possibly, as has happened during those other proxy wars that we saw play out during the Cold War, it may be that the eventual resolution of this particular crisis is not through direct negotiations between Iran and Israel, but through some kind of negotiation, eventual negotiation, maybe many months down the line, maybe even years down the line, between the Americans and the Russians. To a certain extent, that was how the Vietnam War played out. The détente that President Nixon and Henry Kissinger pursued with the Soviet Union and their opening to China was, to a very great extent, about trying to establish contacts with the countries, the superpowers that had leverage over North Vietnam in order to facilitate a settlement process with North Vietnam. And of course, in the previous all-out conflict in Asia, the Korean War, that went very much further. you could almost say that the Geneva Conference that eventually brought the Korean War, well, to the point of armistice, was one that the Americans and the Soviets effectively agreed with each other. So, anyway, just saying, Shoigu's presence in Tehran is taking us closer to proxy war territory. But it also means, by the way, something else in military terms, which is that just as the United States is now deploying military and other assets to the Middle East, I talked about the aircraft carriers and the amphibious warfare carriers and the Raptor fighter jets and all of that, which are now piling up in the Middle East from the United States to protect Israel. Well, we're starting to see something similar begin to happen on the other side, with the Russians, obviously on a significantly lesser scale, but also starting to do things intended to protect Iran, providing Iran with electronic warfare systems, perhaps radars, perhaps air defense missiles, perhaps satellite and other assistance, perhaps drone and intelligence assistance, all of those things, creating maybe a kind of technological equivalence between the two sides of a sort that we have not seen in the Middle Eastern conflicts, well, since the 1970s. Anyway, there it is. An interesting and important development, Sergei Shoigu's visit to Tehran. We haven't, of course, been provided with a huge amount of information about this visit. The Russians and the Iranians will keep this information to themselves. And, of course, where the Russians go, the Chinese tend to follow. The Chinese, with enormous resources that they could bring to bear, but also probably at some level saying to themselves, well, if the Americans are bogged down in a proxy war in the Middle East, on top of the proxy war in Ukraine that they are also struggling through and losing, well, that plays to our advantage. We can press ahead, strengthening our own positions in East Asia. And by the way, it has gone completely unnoticed, but there is now, to all appearances, a breakthrough in Russian relations. I'm talking about Russian relations in Asia. And not just Russian relations, but of course, again, where the Russians go, the Chinese follow. Now, a couple of months ago, as we remember, Vladimir Putin visited North Korea. There's been a lot of speculation about what kind of agreements were reached during that time. We know that a mutual security pact was agreed. The North Koreans are supposed to have agreed to supply Russia with weapon systems for the war in Ukraine. That might be true. Again, I'm not sure that the evidence is quite as conclusive about this as some say. But anyway, a very strong relationship between the Russians and the North Koreans, and the Chinese have gone out of their way to make clear that they are absolutely happy that this has happened. And by the way, there have been a series of floods in North Korea, and Putin telephoned Kim Jong-un and offered assistance. Just saying. So, a strong relationship between Russia and North Korea developing. And then Putin followed up a short time later with trips to Vietnam and Malaysia, and the Russians established close relations with both countries and the relationship, this visit appears to have consolidated the Russian visit to these countries. And, sorry, I meant Thailand. Thailand is now apparently indicating that it wants to join the BRICS, and so is Malaysia, which recently hosted the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov, apparently Indonesia, also saying, like Thailand, that it wants to join the BRICS. But apparently, an even more remarkable development, one which has attracted almost no attention, is that the president-elect of Indonesia, Prabowo Subianto, has also just gone to Moscow, where he's had a meeting with Putin. Notice that he's the president-elect of Indonesia. The president of Indonesia backs this visit. The current president of Indonesia backs this visit. But the new president-to-be of Indonesia, who is former Indonesian defense minister, former army general, somebody with an interesting past, by the way, he took the decision, even before he became formally president, to visit Moscow and to have a meeting with Putin. Now, Indonesia is a huge country, island country. Its economy is growing very fast. And, well, President-elect Subianto made some, I thought, really quite remarkable comments when he was in Moscow. He said that that he's very delighted to be there, that he's been to Moscow 4 times, that he brings the best regards from the existing Indonesian president, President Joko Widodo. And he then went on to say this. He then went on to say this. As you know, we consider Russia a great friend. I would like to continue to maintain and enhance this relationship. In our history, we remember that Russia has always helped us in many aspects. We were in difficulties, Russia helped us. Although at that time, of course, it was the Soviet Union. If you come to Jakarta today, many of the big infrastructure facilities were built by Russians, by the Soviet Union. Our Parliament House, our National Congress, our National Stadium, our National Monument, our first highway, many bridges in many parts of Indonesia were built by, at that time, the Soviet Union. You also helped us to build up our military forces when we were under threat. This is something that we inherit from our parents, that we must never forget, those who helped us. Now, what President-elect Subianto is talking about is the very close relationship that Indonesia had for a certain period of time in the 1960s with the Soviet Union at a time when Indonesia was led by its first president, President Sukarno. Now, President Sukarno eventually lost power. He was forced to resign in 1967 after a very, very tangled and complicated coup, the history of which I'm not going to discuss in this program, which brought to power Indonesia's next president, an army general called General Suharto. Now, General Suharto was a staunch friend and ally of the United States. Now, as I understand it, President-elect Subianto is a protege or former protege of President Suharto. And here he is praising and talking up the relationship that the Soviet Union used to have with Indonesia in the 1960s under Suharto's predecessor, President Sukarno. quite an interesting and remarkable development, especially to anybody who knows Indonesian history, and a firm indication, I think, that Indonesia is also planning to join the BRICS. The reason all of these countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the others, Thailand, are speaking to the Russians at this point of time, rather than directly to the Chinese, is because Russia is the current chair of the BRICS. But the Chinese will be saying to themselves, well, Americans are bogged down in the Middle East, they're bogged down in Ukraine. All of these East Asian countries are now seeking to improve relations with our Russian friends. They're looking to join the BRICS. Ultimately, that works to our advantage, our diplomatic position in Asia. The Asia-Pacific region is becoming stronger. So, this conflict in the Middle East has an important geopolitical dimension, global geopolitical dimension, one which I suspect is going to increase, and suffice to say, in a way that I do not see as positive for the United States. Anyway, that's one proxy war that is emerging. There is, of course, the existing proxy war in Ukraine, which continues and continues to go worse and worse for Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians tried to spin some good news for themselves. The first F-16s have arrived in Ukraine. President Zelensky had himself obviously photographed with them. So far, these F-16s don't appear to have done anything very much. We're now being told that they're being held back and will carry out pure air defense roles, so they will not be sent into battle over the line of contact. The Russians have systematically demolished the Ukrainian Air Force to the extent that it still operates over the line of contact. Over the line of contact, the Russians have complete air superiority. The Ukrainians may believe that they can use F-16s to shoot down Russian subsonic and perhaps even supersonic cruise missiles. I understand the F-16s would not be capable of shooting down hypersonic missiles like the Kinzhal and the Zircon, which the Russians are now deploying in ever larger quantities. So, and of course the Russian Air Force will before long begin hunting the F-16s. There's been various Russian commentaries about this. They're saying that the presence of the F-16s will give the Ukrainians a brief boost in morale, but it will do nothing more. It will not affect the actual development of the war. And I am sure that this is right. Now, Ukraine did carry out a major missile strike on Lugansk region. They've also carried out a drone attack on a Russian airbase within Russia itself. We have satellite pictures from the airbase. It shows no aircraft damaged or destroyed as a result of the drone attack. What damage the missile strike on Lugansk did, I can't really say. The Ukrainians have made another claim that they've destroyed the Russian submarine Rostov-on-Don. I've seen no reference to this from any Russian reporting site or blogger. My sense is that none of these reports really should be taken excessively seriously. But on the battle lines, things are getting worse and worse for Ukraine. There's been film evidence now which shows Russian troops fighting deep inside the village of Konstantinovka near to Vuhledar. And it does look as if the Russians are pressing forward in Konstantinovka, and though the village will probably fall, it'll probably take some time before the village falls, no doubt at some point soon it will. We also have reports from the Russians. The Russians yesterday, confirmed that Novoselivka Persha, the village of Novoselivka Persha, has fallen under their control in the Pokrovsk area. We're told, TASS reports that this is a strategically important location. Its liberation actually means the expansion of the zone of control over Ukraine's major logistics hub in the Pokrovsk area, a considerable expansion. So that's what an official of the Russian law enforcement, very vague title, allegedly told TASS. So Novoselivka Persha has fallen. But as more importantly, we are now getting more reports from the Russians, that there is a major encirclement of Ukrainian troops in this area where Novoselivka Persha has just been captured. This is near Pokrovsk. And this is another report today from TASS. Units from at least 3 Ukrainian military brigades have been surrounded in the village of Zhelanne in the Pokrovsk sector. Before the weekend, Kiev pulled units from 3 brigades to Zhelanne as it hoped to keep the defences there. They have been encircled as a result. Ukrainian forces have sought to use drones to improve their positions, but these have been jammed by Russian electronic warfare systems. So this is a further report from the Russians. Remember the military circles, as I discussed a few days ago, the Russian military circles were telling TASS that there's an encirclement operation underway near Zhelanne, and here we have further information about it. And I've seen reports from places like the Military Summary Channel, which appear to provide further confirmation of this, though they don't quite refer to what looks like confirmation of the Cauldron near Zhelanne and Novoselivka Persha that we are getting from TASS. Now, to be clear, this is a big encirclement. I'm not suggesting that you're talking about thousands of men, but elements of 3 Ukrainian brigades apparently encircled in this area. So we're talking about several hundred men at least. This looks like a real encirclement, not the kind of imaginary or fictional encirclement that we were hearing a week ago about those Ukrainian troops who were supposedly trapped in a cauldron north of the village of Progress. And we have been getting more reports in this area of the Pokrovsk area of more Russian advances west and north of Timofeevka. It does seem as if the Russians are now intent on capturing further villages in this area as they move towards the main supply road, between Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar, which lies to the east. There's reports that the Russians, having captured Timofeevka, are now pushing south towards Lozovatska and ultimately, pushing south towards Lysychne, another village, and that they're also going to advance from this village towards the village of Sviridonovka. And, well, if you look at the map, you can see how this all works to provide a major operational space for a Russian attack on Vozvyzhenka, which I'm sure is coming. And dramatic as this news is, we've also got further news basically confirming what looks like a complete collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the Toretsk area. There's reports that the Russians are now closing the Cauldron, which may exist, involving Ukrainian troops west of New York. They have captured, apparently, the entirety now of the village of Zhelanne. They've also appeared to be close to capturing the Artyom coal mine, which lies north of this village. But they're also pushing south, capturing further village, another village that lies between Zhelanne and New York. And if this village is captured, well, then that would definitely, as far as I can see, mean the final end of the defenses, the Ukrainian defenses in the area around Zhelanne. It would mean the final closing of this Cauldron. And there were reports this morning that the Russians have established fire control over this village, which goes by the name of Nelipivka. And, well, if that's true, if all of that is true, then Ukrainian defenses in the New York area will finally have collapsed. All the main villages around Toretsk, or at least to the south of Toretsk, will be under full Russian control. The Russians have apparently entered Toretsk. It looks as if the Russians are now in a position soon to begin a storming operation of Toretsk. So all the signs are of a deteriorating situation for the Ukrainians there as well in the Toretsk area. And, well, the Ukrainians now having finally acknowledged that the Russians have crossed the aqueduct and have established themselves in central Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians are now admitting further Russian advances in the central area of Chasiv Yar. My own view is that within the next couple of days, we're going to have confirmation that the situation for the Ukrainians in Chasiv Yar is now critical, and that Ukrainian defenses there are finally about to collapse. So we can see that even as the United States is being pulled into a new proxy war by its Israeli ally in the Middle East, an ally it has shown no capacity to restrain, a proxy war in which the Russians are there on the other side, and one in which the Chinese are preparing themselves to take advantage of. Even as that happens, the existing proxy war, the one in Ukraine, goes from bad to worse. No one expects the F-16s to change the situation. And, of course, the Patriot missiles, if the Middle East explodes into war, they're going to be needed there. There won't be enough of them to provide to Ukraine. Well, there never have been enough of them, but there'll be even fewer of them to provide to Ukraine. And frankly, the situation for Ukraine is going to become terrible. So, two proxy wars, one being lost, one risking bogging the United States further down, the Iranians unwilling to be bought off, saying that they're prepared to go to war because they've been left with no choice. The United States, again, having allowed its Israeli ally to engage in a succession of extreme provocations against Iran, just as the United States itself, with its Ukrainian ally, engaged in successive provocations over the course of the Ukrainian conflict towards Russia. The United States then finding that the conflict it has sought to provoke finally happens, and the United States then discovering that in both conflicts it has bitten off far more than it can chew. It really is astonishing how the political and military leadership of the United States repeatedly allows the United States to get into these kinds of situations. But there it is. We will have to wait and see when the Iranian attack comes and what the Israeli response will be. And for the moment, the initiative is with Tehran. I've just said that the United States is repeatedly led by its leadership into situations which are very bad for the United States. But Professor Theodore Postol, in an interview which Glenn Deason and I recently did with him, and which has now been published on the Duran, was discussing with us a new situation which is now arising, which is an order of magnitude more dangerous than any of the other situations that we have seen up to now. Briefly, all of these other situations, they are potentially very dangerous, but they are not such as would immediately threaten or potentially threaten the very existence of the United States and arguably the rest of humanity as well. What Professor Postol was describing was a series of incredible, catastrophic decisions being made at the highest level of the United States government, which do potentially threaten the existence of the United States and of most of humanity. And having listened to what Professor Postol had to say, I now realize that I have greatly underestimated in recent programs the immense danger posed by this catastrophic decision that the United States is now taking to base intermediate range missiles in Germany. Now, I ought to say one person who has predictably, enthusiastically come out and supported this new action is, as one might have guessed, Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock. And she has done so on the usual predictable basis that these missiles are needed in order to protect Germany against Russia. As a simple piece of logic that already, even to me, makes no sense, even based on the knowledge that I had prior to the meeting with Professor Postol, the interview with Professor Postol, that made no sense to me. The very fact that weapons are located, stationed in Germany, that have the reach to attack targets in Russia, invites Russian retaliation against those weapons. Those weapons are, of course, located in Germany. So basing those weapons in Germany puts Germany, by definition, at much greater risk than Germany would be in if those weapons were not originally there. This was very well understood in the past. Annalena Baerbock's own Green predecessors, Petra Kelly and General Bastian, along with many other Green leaders in the late 1970s and early 1980s, were making precisely this point when they opposed and protested and led massive protests against the positioning in Germany of an earlier generation of American missiles. But what I had not realized, and what Professor Postol has explained, is that these missiles, especially if they have hypersonic capabilities, as is promised, now pose a whole new set of dangers. Briefly, these missiles will, if launched, reach the radar coverage of the Russian air defense system, the ground-based radar coverage of the Russian air defense system, at a point where the Russians only have 2 minutes warning of their coming. And as Professor Postol correctly said, that leaves far too little time for the Russian leaders to be able to make any decisions as to how to respond. The Russians are going to have to respond to these deployments in advance, and inevitably, the way they're going to do that is by dispersing decision making, by giving individual missile commanders, nuclear missile commanders across Russia, permission to act and to launch missiles of their own against European and American targets in the event of an attack on Moscow, which does not give the Russian leadership time to respond itself. And no doubt protocols are already being developed, designed in Russia to cover these very eventualities, setting out the steps that Russian missile commanders will need to follow before they do launch the attacks, and giving standing orders on how those attacks will need to be conducted. That, of course, automatically removes control of the use of Russian missiles from the political leadership, from Putin and Belousov and Shoigu and Lavrov and people like that, and places them in the hands of admittedly senior but purely military officers who will feel that they have no option but to follow, to observe the protocols. Now, Professor Postol, in a response to questions that Glenn Deason and I asked him, explained why it would be impossible for the Russians to obtain further notice, more advanced notice of the launching of these missiles. He explained why the Russians operate a ground-based, radar-based air defense system rather than full-spectrum satellite coverage such as the United States has, using infrared cameras to detect rocket launches. And by the way, I've already seen that some people take issue with this. They seem to feel annoyed that Professor Postol should suggest that the Russians in this area are technologically behind the United States, despite the fact that Professor Postol was careful to make clear that Russian scientists are at least as capable as American scientists are. The reality is that in any technological race, some parties will be ahead of other parties. It is a question of commitment of resources, and I have no doubt that on this issue, the United States, as Professor Postol said, has committed far more resources than the Russians have done. That's all there is to it. The key thing to take away is that for the moment at least, and probably for some time ahead, the Russians do not have the ability to track these American missiles, to detect these American missile launches as soon as they happen, which means that they will only get 2 minutes warning when the missiles, before the missiles reach them. I have to say that even the 20-minute warning the Russians might have, if the Americans, even if the Russians were to develop this kind of infrared satellite-based tracking system that the Americans have, even those 20 minutes, in my opinion, would be nowhere near sufficient to allow a proper, orderly process of decision-making to take place in Moscow, before the missiles arrived. So, given that this is where we are, we now have a situation where political leaders in Moscow are no longer going to be in a position to take control of a decision-making process on the assumption that we are indeed brought to the very brink of a nuclear war. Now, that is absolutely terrifying. It means that the kind of negotiations that took place between Kennedy and Khrushchev in 1962 and during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis will now become incredibly difficult. The Russians will be aware of the existence of these weapons. They will be extremely worried that in a time of crisis, the Americans might launch those weapons against them. They're likely to activate the protocols that I discussed as soon as the crisis reaches that point. And, well, no doubt there will be fail-safes, but fail-safes can break down, and decisions to launch a world war might potentially take place on the initiative of commanders. One would have thought that the US government would want to avoid that kind of disastrous situation arising. But Professor Postol has described a scenario that I have become extremely used to over the time when I have been making these programs. He is an expert in these matters. There is no one more expert than him. And what he discovered is that a wall of hostility was all he encountered whenever he sought to bring this issue up in discussions with officials in the Pentagon and in the United States government. They close their eyes, they close their ears, they don't seek him out and consult him or other scientists like him. They make the decisions, and they will not be diverted from that path, however dangerous those decisions will be. And expert after expert that I've sought out, experts in the Russian industrial complex, for example, discussing the ability to produce weapon systems, Russia's ability to produce weapon systems, experts apparently in the financial world, experts in the oil industry. They all say the same thing. Many of them say it publicly. The decisions are made about which they are not consulted, even when it relates to their specific area of expertise, and when they have expertise and specialist knowledge which would be essential in making the correct decision. We have seen how decision after decision that has been made in this way by a small group of political insiders who don't want to consult experts because, well, they already know in advance what they're going to do. How that has led us to failure, led the West to failure after failure, time and again. In the wars in the Middle East, the wars in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, in the war in Ukraine, in the management of Western economies, in all kinds of things. And now the same pattern of refusal to listen to the genuine experts. I don't mean, the self-interested experts of the military-industrial complex, or dare I say it, parts of the pharmaceutical industry, which, well, we saw over the course of recent events that took place a few years ago. I mean, the real experts. What the effect of this has been, And now we see what the effect of it might be. To my mind, what this tells me is the imperative importance of restoring political accountability and democratic control over the decision-making process in the United States. Now, I've been talking about this for several years, ever since Alex Christoforo and I basically started doing programs on for the Duran. Will this change? Will there be any change in the political situation to restore that accountability and democratic control? Maybe. But let us be under no doubt, if that fails to happen, then of course mistakes will continue to be made and they will pile up. But we now see a genuine risk that these mistakes could one day become existential. Anyway, this is where I'm going to, this unhappy thought, this is where I'm going to end today's program. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget that you can check out our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things there. And last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.